My brief is to consider in design terms the impact of China in particular upon the Western world, an impossible task that could fill the next few days. To simplify things a bit, I'm going to say that China, and to a lesser extent Japan, shaped and dominated Western ceramics from the 17th century to the 19th century in a direct way. And in a less direct way, but more universal way, Asian ceramics had an immense impact upon Western culture in the 18th century and in more significantly in the 19th century, and have continued to do so to the present day. The way to understand this to me is to look at paintings and illustrations. So, let's begin a bit earlier than Nick with James Abbott Neil Whistler. These paintings of the 1860s show to me the impact of the Far Eastern upon Western culture. Notably the two famous ones, Symphony in White No. 2, or The Little White Girl, and Rose and Silver, or The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. The girls are placed within a setting composed largely of Chinese and Japanese objects of various periods and randomly assembled, and they simply show that the passion for Far Eastern art, in a very mixed up way, was beginning to take over our culture. Exactly the similar things are happening in France at exactly the same time. And if we move on, another example, and certainly one of my favourites, is Louise Joplin's Blue and White of 1896. Two girls, clearly well-bred and wearing aesthetic dress in a very fashionable style, are washing the family collections of mostly Chinese and other Far Eastern objects. And this shows, again, a similar background and interest in Oriental ceramics in standard sort of upper-class family life. They wouldn't trust the servants to wash the Chinese pots, so they do it themselves. And I think it's a lovely vision of how that world was at that time. The fact that it was also used as a version for soap, I think also brings certain things close to home. I'm always intrigued what the bowl is that they're using for doing the washing. Is it cloisonné or is it something else? It doesn't really matter. I mean, you can go along the shelves plate by plate saying what is it. But the fact is it's a mixed up collection that was so typical of 19th century ones at that time. A third example, and this is picked from a large collection of similar paintings of interiors at that time. It shows a girl playing a keyboard instrument in a room setting typical of late Victorian Britain. Far Eastern blue and white, Japanese fans, a 17th century style brass dish, and a late 18th century style chair, a sort of Morris wallpaper. It says it all. This is how people lived at that time, with a very significant impact from the Far East. And I think the impact of Japan was particularly strong during this period, as we shall see, indicated by the range of ceramics made and sold by stores such as Liberty's. When it was founded in 1875, don't forget, it wasn't called Liberty's, it was called the Oriental Bazaar. And what did they sell? Well, they sold things like this. They sold contemporary Japanese ceramics. They sold contemporary British versions and interpretations of those sort of things. And of course also, these ideas have been around for a long time. If we go back 20 or 30 years and look what Minton were doing, they were producing a whole range of things. Inevitably, I have to mention the word dresser in connection with some of these. But this is not the point. We're looking at things that draw widely from Japanese and Chinese sources in a wonderfully muddled way. Because the point is, nobody cared, actually, particularly. I don't mean the designers, but the buyers didn't care where they came from. And thus we get these very, very random and mixed associations. And if we take this one step further, we get wonderful concepts like Anglo-Japanese drawing room furniture. Well, the Japanese didn't have drawing rooms, and they didn't really have much furniture. So where are we going with that? And of course, the greatest impact is things like the huge success of the Mikado, the fantasy world of the Far East brought to life in a very significant way. The dominance of Chinese and Japanese ceramics over a long period, to me, can be expressed in 5 words, seem to be crucial in any consideration of ceramic design. Creativity, quality, consistency, quantity, and consumability. These are like the four C's of the diamond. I think those words really one should remember for all the things we're thinking about. But the best way to appreciate how good the Chinese were at all of these is to look at the patterns of production and trade revealed by shipwreck studies. The most important of these was discovered in 1985 of the Geldermalsen, a VOC ship lost in transit in 1752 between Canton and Amsterdam. Captain Hatcher, a great pioneer, who found the wreck, raised 100,000 pieces of blue and white porcelain bound for the European market, which were sold by Christie's as the Nanking cargo in Amsterdam for over 15 million. This was the first, and so it was the most significant. And of course, this set a benchmark which was very rarely matched. I mean, anybody can now buy pieces of the Nanking cargo on eBay on a daily basis, as you know, for not very much. They're not difficult to get. But the point is not that. The point is that shipwrecks tell us so much. Thanks to research and ever-improving technology, many more wrecks have been found, with cargoes dating from the 9th century Tang period onwards. Many, of course, of these were not bound for Europe. China, as a ceramic trading nation, was well established, as we see, in the 9th century. They were selling to Korea, they were selling to all sorts of places in the Far East. But of course, a sequence of 18th century wrecks can now give us a clear view of the scale and style of the Chinese export trade to Europe. These are the ships: Bintang, 1710, Kamau, 1720s, Nanking, as we saw, 1752, Diana, 1817, and Texing, 1821. This last named carried 350,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain, and that was as late as 1821. And it continues. In May 2023, a couple of months ago, a new wreck was discovered at a depth of 1.5 kilometres with a cargo of 100,000 pieces of porcelain from the Ming period that were on its way to Europe. And so what we see is an extraordinary vision under the sea, or brought under the sea, of what the Chinese were up to. Here are two examples from later wrecks. Chongzheng 17th century wares en masse, and 9th century Tang wares, again rescued from the deep. These, to me, are very revealing. And of course it also reveals the almost total dominance of blue and white, clearly the taste of the European market. At the same time, it must not be forgotten that rediscovered shipwrecks represent only a small fraction of the international trade between China and the West in the 17th and 18th centuries. There are many, many more shipwrecks still to be discovered, but even more important are the large number of ships that made it safely back to Europe. Far more than there are shipwrecks. Even so, I find it almost impossible today to grasp the sheer quantity of this trade and the scale of it and its importance through this period. Images of these shipwrecks demonstrate both the total dominance of China of the European market for tablewares and ornaments, and show the mastery of the Chinese potters of my 5 words: creativity in forming patterns and styles specifically to appeal to the European market, quality in making wares that were excellent for their market, despite being far from the best ceramics that China could produce, consistency and quality achieved on a level and a scale beyond the wildest dreams of European potters, and consumability in their skill in making and selling ceramics perfectly suited to the tastes of a far distant, largely alien market, at a speed and cost that no 18th century European potter could match. To put this into context, it suggests that, with the obvious exceptions of major manufacturers and major manufacturing centres, much of the European ceramic industry was at best supplying local and niche markets. Anyone ordering a dinner service from Sèvres, Chelsea, Derby in the 18th century had to be both very wealthy and very patient. Let's look now at the impact of Japan upon Europe in more detail. Their direct dependence upon Chinese ceramics is affected in 2 ways. The first is in the use of the blue and white decoration, a style and technique that rose to prominence in China during the Ming Dynasty and then remained popular throughout subsequent centuries, as reflected by the shipwreck cargoes. Here we have a group of pieces from the 15th century and onwards that just simply indicate the diversity and richness of this production. we're looking obviously at pieces made for various markets, a ewer for the Islamic market, and each piece specifically aimed at the market for which it was going to. And these pieces are an indication of the sort of things that were not necessarily coming to Europe, but were that dominated Chinese production at the time. And this, of course, went on and developed through the 20th century, through the 17th and 18th century onwards. More examples there, with a greater emphasis on shapes, because it's not just pattern, it's also shape that becomes very significant in the West. And this, of course, is then continued, and we begin inevitably to copy it. Craftwares and similar things coming from both China and Japan, as we heard, are very rapidly copied by the Delftware potters, Dutch and British. And these things begin to reflect, again, this enduring European passion with the Far East. Delftware is the first stage in this process of recreating or trying to recreate what had come out of the Far East. Delftware of the 17th and 18th century, again, indicative very much of that source. English Delftware, Liverpool, Lambeth, elsewhere, again, picking up on these traditions via Holland, and of course via other sources. And inevitably, without going into great detail, we spin off into British porcelain. The early, it starts, of course, at Meissen and other European factories. It then spreads via Bow and Worcester and Derby and Liverpool, etc., from the 1850s onwards. And of course, linked to this is this passion for the decoration upon a white ground. I think one can say practically the whole of the upper echelon of ceramic production, particularly in Britain in the 18th and early 19th century, was all about white grounds. It wasn't really about the pattern so much as the white ground. Get the white ground, and then everything else is possible. And this, of course, spreads into other bodies such as pearlware. And indeed, we see with these bodies, creamware, pearlware, stone china, all emerge as a way of reflecting this pursuit of the white body. Chinese patterns abound, but they are but one of the many used to decorate wares that featured the white body. The second feature of Chinese ceramics that changed Western taste is exactly that, it's the white ground. It was the pursuit of this elusive white ground that fixated European potters throughout the 18th century. The aesthetic and the philosophical ideal represented by all Chinese porcelain, and the one most sought after in Europe. It can be argued that in terms of lasting impact, the white ground is an even greater legacy of Chinese ceramics in Europe than blue and white. A pure white ground was the dream pursued by all European potters in the 18th century, but one rarely achieved or consistently maintained. Most had to be satisfied with imitations, such as Delftware, white stoneware, creamware, soft-based porcelain, or versions of other porcelains, but often technically inadequate or erratic in quality. This didn't really change until the last decade of the 18th century, when advances in technology began to reshape the European ceramic industry, particularly in Britain. Let's just take a willow pattern plate, because that reflects so much of this revolution. First, it is made from a white earthenware achieved by increasingly refined clay preparation, including the use of Cornish china clays and improved kiln technology. From this came other white clay bodies such as ironstone, much more important, bone china. This pure, white, translucent, completely consistent and relatively cheap body seemed to fulfill that major Chinese-inspired dream about white porcelain. And at a time when both Chinese and Japanese export trades were in decline, it launched the British ceramic industry onto the global stage. From this point, at the start of the 19th century, Europe, and Britain in particular, began to dominate the international ceramic market and replace the dominance hitherto enjoyed by Asian manufacturers. This was to continue until the 1980s, when the newly emergent Asian ceramic industries began to take back control of the global market. So in a sense, the period of European production of tablewares that fixates us is barely 200 years. It's all to do with the Far East, and once again, it's all to do with the Far East. And I think this is something we should always remember, that our chapter in this story is really quite small. Throughout this short period of European dominance, the popularity of Chinese and Japanese styles and patterns remains strong, with the perennial enthusiasm for blue and white undiminished. The other signs of exchange reflected by that willow pattern plate is the use of printed decoration. The transfer printing process developed in the 1750s was, by the end of the 18th century, of widespread use, and other printing technologies were being developed, including experiments in colour printing. This brought about both cost savings and better production consistency, and so potters were better able to satisfy the needs of a rapidly expanding consumer market. The willow pattern itself is also an interesting reflection of this global economic shift, being a Chinese-style pattern invented in Britain as a collage of familiar Chinese motifs and made over decades for an international market. And of course, as we see on the other one, the Chinese themselves in the early 19th century were compelled to reproduce it and copy it, because that's what the English or that's what the Europeans wanted. Their versions, of course, were painted rather than printed, because they didn't really have printing by then. And therefore, thanks to new technologies, this plate, the willow pattern, the standard willow pattern, along with other closely related designs, really satisfies my 5 words: creativity, quality, consistency, quantity, and consumability.